They're looking at balance between the interest of innovators and public. Should it be through a policy framework or a regulatory framework? Should IPR be treated like any other movable or immovable property? And third is lacunas in India's IPR regime, which do not support ease of doing business. See, as far as the question of balance between public interest and innovators' interest is concerned, I think this is a foregone conclusion. There has to be balance. But when we come to ease of doing business, if you look at the situation from the post-WTO scenario, where it is the international business which is becoming important, there's nothing like domestic business anymore, because anybody from outside can come and play. The question is, how do we perceive the global trade and commerce? And if you view this trade and commerce with only one lens, we are likely to make some mistakes and also affect the ease with which international trade can take place. The situation is very complex because we are dealing with multiple number of companies, multiple cultural systems, economic systems, and social systems. And if we want to have a uniform law or practice in the IPR area, then we need to be a little careful. In this context, I personally feel the world found a good answer to these issues by going for a multilateral system like we have for TRIPS or WTO, which has been a good choice, but a good balance between the interest of all concerned. So you can always put these interested concerns into the innovator and the public interest. But what is happening today, and we have to be quite sensitive to these developments. 1995 we had the WTO, and now it's 20 years. For whatever reasons, I think this is something which needs to be debated, perhaps not in this platform, is that there is a trend now going towards plurilateralism and bilateralism. And this is where countries are putting their stakes and trying to work out new system or invent new systems. You know, some of you may remember that when India agreed for a number of provisions in TRIPS, because we were not very experienced at that point of time, we didn't perhaps even know, the negotiators did not know what the patent laws were all about. But certainly, we were given a carrot on the multi-fiber trade concessions in Europe and US. In fact, after the WTO signature, this never materialized. We never got that advantage. So there is an issue. Now I would like just to point out some of the international developments which are a matter of great interest to me and also perhaps concern. These are the IP5, the ACTA, and the TPP. ACTA stands for Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, and TPP is Trans-Pacific Partnership. And if you look at these agreements which are taking place, most of them are behind camera, but reports do come. They start with moving towards harmonization of patent practices and perhaps patent laws, which was not the intent of TRIPS, severe penalties on copyrights and trademarks, patent term extension based on clinical data exclusivity, dispense with more strict patentability criteria, and essentially to join UPOV 1991. And in addition, there is an attempt to develop a parallel dispute settlement system as against the dispute settlement system enshrined in TRIPS. Now we have, in India, we have laws on many things. We are all aware of Section 3D, which was a topic of great interest all over. And similar legal provisions and practices, they came under attack by many different agencies, including agencies in India. In regard to Section 3D, it has been a very contentious issue, and we still don't have very clear-cut technical answers. But there are research papers based on hospital studies over a period of 10 to 15 years, which suggest that secondary patents, which are essentially you're going for new salts or the parent salt, this approach of issuing patents has come in the way of the availability of generics at a reasonable price to the patients. And this was the whole idea of generic drugs when it came in US. Now what happens by secondary patents, people are going for some kind of follow-on drug and then utilizing the marketing network of big drug companies and pharma companies, these drugs are being issued or prescribed by doctors in the health delivery system. May not be true everywhere, but this is a study based in Switzerland. Recently, the trade policy review of India took place under WTO, and in which a substantial portion was on Indian IP system. And it is interesting, perhaps encouraging for us, TPR never mentioned that Indian laws are not TRIPS compliant. The other issue which is there on CL. Now CL fine the government has taken because this was a repetition of patent acts which was there pre-1970 and 1970, and we didn't want to work very hard to look at the old laws properly and see how they can be reworded and put into a situation which is market friendly. But however, the recent decision by the patent office of offering or giving CL to Netco on this patent cancer drug called Nexavar, I do have two observations. Fine, the law is there, but we must have a process or a system of implementing that law. Today we don't even know whether or not Netco is producing that amount of drugs, and is it supplying drugs to so many people which they promised in the CL license. What is the cost at which they are delivering these drugs? This is not available in public domain. I think this is a simple thing. This does not require any change in law, but it's only a system. If these things can be put in public domain, it creates more confidence. The second thing, any process of awarding CL is a complicated process according to me, because it does not include only one field of specialization. It is not only patents, but as patents come in the last when you make a decision, is a question of affordability, prices, availability, and economics, the social things and other things which are very, very important. So can we have a system where the whole decision-making system of CL is more broad-based? Today, the law says that CG is empowered, but law does not say that CG cannot appoint advisors to take onto this decision. If we have people from various areas, it will perhaps make things easier, and the credibility of the system in India would be more acceptable to the outside world. Look at the plant variety protection, which is so important for India. If you look at the average land holding, the percentage of farmers which have land up to 1 hectare is 75%. But people who have 1 to 2 acres, that constitute 10%, and people having had land more than 10 hectares is 0.24%. Now, when the Plant Variety Act in India was formed and special rights were given to the farmers, the reason was, this was one of the primary reasons, that farmers use their seed from their own crop for various reasons, for bad time, the exchange, and so on and so forth. Now, if we see this context, the Indian context, into the international framework, where some people suggest that UPOV 91 should be the golden standard, it does not suit us. Efficient and effective enforcement of IP laws has been discussed in this country, and it's a matter of concern. I think a lot has been said. It is not only the IPR law, it is all property law. And general legal situation in this country is that people have complaints about it. The pace at which the Indian courts are moving and taking decisions on the cases related to IPR, to me it looks encouraging, from the fact that in 1990s we didn't have any case going to the Supreme Court for patent resolution. Maybe there was one particular case. There's no doubt that the IPR regime is an important factor for ease of doing business in India, especially in cases of technology transfers and licensing. This is important because here where the contracts come, and CII has prepared 2 reports with the help of KPMG dealing with ease of doing business in India, and this is one of the things that we must have a good system for handling contracts. And when you handle contracts in the area of technology, the IPR becomes a natural choice. It is going to be there, and when we talk about Make in India and all those things, these contracts are going to play a very important role. I think it will be very useful for the country as such that we become more flexible in generating our new laws, because if you look at patents, it's so heavily dependent on technology which is moving at a very fast pace. You look at the broadcasting, and I think this is also technology based, it's moving very fast, the IT. So unless our legal system is geared to take into account the technological development and the problems arising out of it, I think will not be placed very well in the international scenario and also in the domestic scenario, because youngsters, they don't want to club their wings just because of laws. May I now request Professor Nirvakar Singh to give your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Saha. I'd like to first thank Bala and the organizers for organizing this really valuable event. I found the morning sessions really quite illuminating, and in some sense, of course, the topic is much deeper than just ease of doing business. It gets to the very heart of how we organize society, in terms of thinking about very fundamental issues of equity and efficiency and the trade-offs between them, and also issues of justice. And of course, in the case of physical property, these issues come up. I think perhaps what I could draw from some of the morning's presentations is that while in thinking about physical property rights, there can be trade-offs between equity and efficiency. It seems that often in the Indian case, we have neither equity nor efficiency, so it's clearly a suboptimal issue. Really, this brings me to, I think, what is a fundamental point in terms of thinking about intellectual property, which is that it is not quite the same as physical property. And of course, that does raise issues in terms of how we handle it from a legal societal perspective. The fundamental difference, of course, is the intangibility and to some extent, perhaps the way that it's the mode of production, the way it's created, it comes out of our minds. So the key economic characteristic that is different, though, is not so much the intangibility, though, as the fact that it's what we call non-rival. If I'm farming a plot of land, nobody else can farm that plot of land. But if I'm implementing an idea, have an idea for producing a product, potentially other people can also use that same idea. And to give you, of course, the starkest example in our modern world, the internet, which I think is still in the beginnings of revolutionizing our global economy, was built on two pieces of software which were just created and given away. I mean, they were just made completely public. The TCP/IP protocol, and then on top of that, the web HTML. I mean, Vint Cerf and Tim Berners-Lee did not seek to copyright or patent anything. They just gave it away. And that basically created this, the foundation of the foundation for the very rapid growth of the internet. See, it's very complicated, though, because that's not to say that everything should be that way. Of course, if everybody was as altruistic and far-seeing as Berners-Lee and Cerf and others, then perhaps we could just leave it all up to everybody's goodwill. But the whole idea of protecting intellectual property is that we want to provide some incentive for innovation. And looking at it from the other perspective, I don't think you would have had the growth in Silicon Valley that you've had and the growth on top of that foundation of the internet that we've had without the commercial incentives that have been created. Now, it's very important to understand, I think, in terms of the overall issue of balance, is that there's no easy answer, there's no universal answer, and it's going to be, I think, very tricky moving forward because, as has been pointed out on several occasions, first of all, we have globalization. Secondly, we have very rapid technological change, and some of these things, some of these institutions go back hundreds of years to a world that was very different. We've sort of dealt with that to some extent with copyright. The copyright term has been steadily extended from 28 years to 70, 95, in different cases. And, is that the right length of copyright? We don't actually have a natural answer. And I don't think we'll ever have one. It's always going to be a matter of negotiation. And in these cases, of course, the issue is whether the political process achieves the appropriate balance between the incentive to innovate and the rights of innovators, rights of creators, with the public benefit. And if we think about patent law, the original, I'm more familiar with the American case. The original term was 17 years from the date of granting the patent. Now it's 20 years from the date of filing. Essentially, that hasn't changed for centuries. How is that number determined? Is it the right one or not? It's impossible to say. It's very, very difficult, I think, to come up with any simple answers. Now, in the context of drugs, that idea has come up several times. It's been talked about how people are using secondary patents and so on. What those are doing is trying to effectively lengthen the patent term without having a legal length of the patent term. And the typical argument for that is that, well, producing drugs is extremely expensive, so you really have to provide larger rewards to the innovator. There's a high degree of failure. My sense actually is that in the case of pharmaceuticals, technological change may actually help us out here, because using bioinformatics, I think the cost of developing new drugs should fall rapidly, I think. And there's still expenses of prototyping and test clinical trials and so on. But really, I think the drug companies' arguments for strict patent protection and all these additional walls and moats that they construct around the original software, again, I think if you think about what's happening, I think there's really it's a mixed situation. To take an example, which I think is very interesting, again, not completely giving away something, but the idea of an open license. So you have the framework of intellectual property rights, but then you choose not to extract full commercial benefit from it. What you do is you create a license, open license, which restricts what you can do with it, but doesn't extract money. So the Linux, for example, is built on that model. I mean, is given away on that model. And you can build a commercial enterprise on that. You can have Linux servers and so on. And in fact, servers built on open source software and also dominate the guts of the internet. So again, I think there are lots of different combinations we can see in terms of how we combine incentives to innovate and the rewards to innovation. I think my own gut feel is that we're probably erring a little bit too much on the side of providing monopoly to innovators, because I think the incentives to innovate, the competition on the innovation side are so strong that maybe we should think a little bit more about the public benefit side. And that doesn't mean that you should not have some intellectual property protection, but we shouldn't overdo it.
It's a wonderful opportunity to air some thoughts on both some of these theoretical aspects of perceiving intellectual property rights and also addressing some of these practical concerns that we have today regarding enforcement. What is the right model of IP enforcement that we need to develop in India? Is there an Indian way of thinking about IP? There are Indian ways about thinking about everything, I think. So surely there must be an Indian way of thinking about IP too. Broadly, there are 3 or 4 theoretical models that we use when we look at property relations. One is your traditional Blackstonian idea that property is your right to exclude. So if someone gets private property, it is a solution to your tragedy of the commons, and as by way of a solution, what we have done is given someone the right to exclude. But there are counter theories to this model, and one is the conception of property as a bundle of rights, where the right to exclude is certainly an important stick in the bundle, but it's not the only one. And in which case you look at property as a kind of user rights. So you're not really making the owner the sole and despotic dominion as Blackstone defined the owner, but you're looking at users as well. And what they do with this particular right becomes essential to the very definition of property. The third model, which is emerging today in the United States, especially in the Cornell Law School, and when it comes to theorizing property, is the progressive property movement. So the progressive property movement scholars look at property also as a mechanism, an instrumental mechanism to bring about the flourishing of certain important human values. Now, what are these values? They vary. I mean, depending on the scholar who's advancing the proposition. Some of them, for instance, take the view that property is meant to further democracy, some that it's meant to further social justice, and so on and so forth. But broadly, they all agree that property is an instrumental idea. It's an instrumental construct meant to achieve certain goals. Now, where does India fit in when you look at this broad landscape of utilitarianism versus natural rights versus Hegelian ideas of property and intellectual property? Again, there is no one real answer, in the sense that when it comes to copyright law, for instance, I largely think the Indian approach is very utilitarian. There is a clear acceptance of the fact that we need to balance the ownership of property with access to that property. So it's not a natural rights model that we follow. It's not that, oh, you have the copyright in this particular work and then you are now the sole and despotic dominion who decides what to do with that particular work. With patent law, again, I think India follows a utilitarian model, because everything that the Patents Act 1970, especially post-TRIPS, the Section 3D and the compulsory licensing regime seem to indicate is that we are looking essentially to balance the ownership of this right with access that the general public have, and the furtherance of such access through generics who can provide access to these drugs. But again, we are not taking a one-size-fits-all, because mostly 3D, though it's applicable across board, is used by the pharma industry. Compulsory licensing is, as far as the regime has worked till now, has been used by the pharma industry. So there is, I think, a sort of sectoral specificity in the direction in which the Patents Act is being implemented and worked currently. Now we come to the Trademarks Act, and there I feel the law is the normative values guiding the law are much more oriented towards a natural rights philosophy, where if you are the brand owner and you've created a brand, then this is your exclusive property and you have the right to exclude. And this takes us to the part about, the practical aspect of working on law, which I want to speak on today, and that's the issue of enforcement. Because if you go with the premise that we largely accept the normative value governing this particular field of law to be the right to exclude, then you need to have effective measures that in place which further this right to exclude. There's no way you can say, okay, I have this right to exclude, unless you have measures to enforce that particular right. So when it comes to trademark law, the big problem today, as far as trademark owners are concerned, even the general public is concerned, is counterfeiting. Why is it a big problem? Various reasons. One, the who question. Who are these counterfeiters? The second, the how question. How does the counterfeiting activity go on? And third, the why question. Why does this happen? Now let's first take the who question. Who are these counterfeiters? The latest OECD report on counterfeiting is a little dated. It came out in 2008-2009 and identifies counterfeiting as a weapon used by terrorist networks. And this is also something borne out by research in United States. So terrorist organizations are primarily involved in using counterfeiting in certain sectors, especially the most important being the pharma sector, counterfeiting of drugs, and even in the automotive sector, to finance their illegal activities. So there is a clear national security, international security issue tied in closely with counterfeiting, though this is not stressed much by the industry, because as a brand owner, you don't really perceive this in a much wider sense than how it impacts your direct business. But this aspect of the problem is important when it comes to creating and aligning behavioral norms on tackling counterfeiting. And I'll address that soon. The next is, where does this really happen? In the sense, which are the important sectors that are affected? As I mentioned already, the pharma sector is heavily affected by counterfeit drugs. So is the automobile industry. Now, why are these two industries and the food and drinks sector, again, the food and beverages sector, important? Because they also show that the nature of market for counterfeiting is not a one-size-fits-all kind of market. There is a primary market and there is a secondary market. The primary market is one where people genuinely believe that what they are buying is the original product, while the secondary market, and which is very common in the case of the apparel industry, the sporting goods industry, etc., is where you know that you are buying something for a much lesser price, but you are fine with it. So you are not a gullible customer. Now the real problem as far as addressing counterfeiting goes arises in the primary market for the simple reason that there is a much larger impact on the public. Conceding that counterfeiting is a big problem because it also impacts the public much more than the brand owner himself and that particular organization. How do you tackle this? Firstly, what are the legal responses that we have in place currently to enforce your right to exclude? Broadly, you have three kinds of remedies. You have civil, criminal, and you have border security measures. The civil measure largely is, getting an injunction from a court of law, there are, multiple remedies within that, like John Doe orders, where you get ex parte orders against unknown infringers. You have ante pillar orders, where you search and seize, infringing goods and so on and so forth. The criminal remedy currently is Section 103 and 104 of the Trademarks Act, where if someone falsely represents and affixes a trademark, you can initiate criminal proceedings, and there is a punishment. There are penalties up to 2 lakhs prescribed, and there is also imprisonment between 6 months and 3 years. Yeah. So now this is the framework that we have in place. But is it working? And this is where we need to really look at the enforcement aspect and the law and behavioral aspect. Is the law able to align behavioral norms around what it seeks to achieve? Honestly, let's just hold our hands to our heart and ask this simple question: how many of us have not ever purchased counterfeit watches or counterfeit apparel or any of this? And why is it that we do so? The singular reason, I think, is because we don't actually perceive this to be a problem. We don't even know about the primary market problem in counterfeiting, most of us. I didn't know this till I went through the OECD report, that there is a huge implication as far as counterfeiting industry goes to one, national security, and two, public health. These were not part of the campaign. The way it is projected to us as citizens is basically that there are these brand owners, they own brands worth billions of dollars, and they are impacted. And honestly, as a consumer, the way I look at it is simply this: Yeah, you have a Ray-Ban, glass, and and you sell these shades, for $3,000, and I'm just buying this duplicate brand, for $300. So how does it really impact you? Because I'm anyway not going to buy the 3,000 rupee one. But the real problem arises because of the primary market. So now, once we establish, and which is what I wanted to do with all of this, that there is a serious problem involved here, then the next big question is, how are we going to address and better the enforcement, stats that we have currently? Firstly, we don't have any stats. That's the first problem. You go through the National Crime Records Bureau, there is absolutely no clear statistic available on conviction rates under your section 103 and 104 of the Trademarks Act. There is no statistic available on even the prosecution rates, on the raids conducted. So currently we are absolutely vague on the extent of counterfeiting going on in the country. The second problem is, suppose we want to really enforce this. Does the law, especially the criminal law, work? To my mind, it does not. Why? Because the prosecutor's incentives to go against the counterfeiter are much less than that of the brand. But at the same time, private prosecution is very narrow under the Criminal Procedure Code, and currently we really don't have a strong framework for private prosecutions done by the brand owner. So because of this, there is a gap between what the law seeks to achieve and what it's currently achieving. Third, information and the alignment of behavioral norms regarding counterfeiting is extremely weak. Let's just look at the parallel situation in the United States. Currently, the most powerful authority on intellectual property is not the USPTO or the Copyright Registrar, but the IP Enforcement Czar. The IP Enforcement Czar basically has a complete bird's eye view of every aspect of enforcement of IP in the United States. So this is just one individual and an office which is at the beck and call of this individual. And we really need to create a strong administrative agency for IP enforcement in India. Currently, courts work to the extent where, suppose you are a Ray-Ban or you are a Nike, you can move courts for a John Doe order. But if you're a small or medium sector enterprise, it's very difficult to enforce your IP because litigation costs are almost prohibitive. And criminal remedies do not work for the simple reason that prosecutors don't really care. So in this particular scenario, the only way we can really address the problem is by creating a federal agency which basically addresses the problem of enforcement. So broadly, we have to look at reforming damages for civil remedies, to have a framework of statutory damages, and reforming the enforcement of criminal remedies, because currently the penalties are not that weak. But the real problem is that there is no recourse to criminal action.
How many of us in this room are aware of the recent change in the software licensing models from a one-time purchase to a subscription-based model? How many of you approve this model? How many of you have heard about standard essential patents, FRAND-related discussions, IP and competition that's taking place currently in India? Post the Novartis judgment of the Supreme Court, how many of you are aware or heard about what's happened to the following 4 molecules in India? Firstly, dasatinib, sitagliptin, vildagliptin, and indacaterol. All these 4 molecules are ones in which all Indian companies have in effect been injuncted post the Novartis judgment. We still are debating the Novartis Supreme Court judgment, which is more than 2 years old, but for some strange and odd reason, I do not find any media coverage of all these 4 molecules where Indian courts have granted orders against more than 15 to 20 Indian pharma companies, some of them ex parte orders, some of them where the merits are yet to be decided, and these drugs are not being sold by any Indian company. Now let me give you the most important facts relating to these drugs, these molecules. All of these drugs are not manufactured in India. All of these molecules are not manufactured in India. Barring one of them, 3 of them do not even satisfy the imports. I mean, the quantity of imports do not satisfy even 0.1% of the population who is affected by these diseases. And they've all enforced their patents in India. How do we strike the balance? The patents have been granted, patents have been recognized, Indian companies have been injuncted, there are minimal imports, there is no manufacturing in India. This is the context in which we need to talk about the balance. Before we talk about the balance, we need to talk about balance for whom, for what. Is balance meant for society, or is it meant for Indian businesses, or is it meant for the innovator businesses, or is it meant for the economy? It is a balance of various factors, not just a balance of one versus the other. Do we all agree unanimously that these medicines are needed for the patient population? If these drugs are needed, patents have been granted and recognized, how is it that the government or the innovators or the Indian generics are going to make these drugs available in India? There are going to be more of them in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years. So let's answer these questions before we go and talk about the balance, because these are the problems which I personally, as a litigator, am facing in courts on a daily basis. Speak about the balance because there are factors which most of the current printed publications don't pick up. When is the last time you read about an article, why are all patented drugs not made in India? Doesn't India have the capability to make them? Look at the Gilead model of licensing. 11 or 12 companies have been granted licenses to a drug which is yet to be patented. Aren't all these Indian companies capable of making it? Very much. Why aren't we looking at collaboration, at licensing models, which is the way to go forward and to bring the balance and to make things more accessible? We should look at different and alternate models. It's not me versus you. It has to be us as part of the balance. Us has to be us, or we has to be the model. Otherwise, the IP system is going to collapse. Then, if the inventor is saying yes, the patient is saying yes, why is it that the IP system is stopping the access? India is like the favorite whipping boy for everybody who wants to criticize India, saying India is anti-patents, anti-IP, anti-TRIPS. I don't know of any other country which recognizes it except India, and maybe Malaysia or a couple of other countries in Southeast Asia. Not a single country. An Indian brand, please go to the US, please go to the UK, please go to China, try and protect it, and you will know it's not possible. Because there the law is first to file in US, first to register in US, first to use in the US. It's in exceptional cases that they give a well-known status to a foreign brand. Even Bukhara, as a known restaurant in the world, failed to protect its mark in the US. We were not able to protect it. ITC was not able to protect it against their own employee who took away the restaurant and called it Bukhara. So in trademarks, India has gone 10 miles ahead in protecting the Apple, the Mercedes, the Bata, the Colgate, the everybody of the world, including Whirlpool. And it has done so consistently for 30 years. 1985 was the first judgment of Bata and Philips. We protected foreign marks across the board. Even without use, even without registration, against Indian registered proprietors. In trademarks, the law is settled. Excellent jurisprudence. Indian jurisprudence on trademarks is worth citing. Let's come to the Copyright Act. Copyright Act, one of the most advanced legislations in the world. Every act in the world has had to change their statute with the internet, with technology. Our Copyright Act is a masterpiece legislation. Every type of electronic communication is covered in the Indian Copyright Act. Broadcasters can go and get a John Doe order for the asking. Books, movies, Everything is protected. Yes, there is an issue of enforcement, especially in the digital era, in the internet. In fact, in my view, in copyright, India is a victim of piracy. Indian Bollywood movies, songs, artists, folk music, everyone across the world pirates it. So India is fighting it with the developed world in the area of copyright. Look at the internet. What a big challenge it poses. I don't think any one of the countries has been able to figure out how to deal with it. Let's come to patents now. In patents, 80% of Indian patents are owned by foreign entities. Unlike in trademarks. In trademarks, 80% is owned by the Indian domestic businesses. In patents, it's exactly the opposite. 80-20 there and 20-80 here. Right? In patents, one compulsory license has been granted since independence. Only one. That's made headlines. So are we seeing a very orchestrated media campaign against India? In my view, yes. It's very sad, but it's true. Let's look at 3D. Who says in India improvements are not patentable? We've heard this again and again and again and again, that improvements are not patentable in India. Has anyone, Indian Patent Act Section 54 permits improvement patents, but what it does not permit is extending the term of the patent beyond the original patent. Not a single company applies for an improvement patent under Section 54 because it doesn't extend the term of the patent. It gives you an improvement patent within the original molecule's lifespan, patent lifespan. So if you invent a particular base molecule today and you invent a salt or a polymorph of it 2 or 3 years down the line, you can patent it as an improvement patent provided you satisfy the test of efficacy, but the term of that salt patent cannot be beyond the life of the base patent. This doesn't suit the business. So that's why in India they say India doesn't grant improvement patent or a patent to incremental innovation, which is a false statement. When TRIPS was negotiated, India was granting 7 years for drugs as the term, but it was made 20 years. But 20 has to be 20, 20 cannot become 50. And that's what it becomes if you allow evergreening. Let me cite the example of the Novartis judgment in the Supreme Court. We filed a volume this thick of 30 to 35 patents on the same molecule imatinib, which were taken. I'm talking of families, not patents. 30 to 35 family of patents on imatinib, which would have extended the monopoly to almost 35 years instead of 20 years. Why should that be justified? If evergreening is wrong, it should not be permitted. That's my view. So therefore, improvement and incremental innovation is patentable provided you satisfy the test of efficacy and you don't extend the term of the patent. The entire Microsoft, Apple kind of industry is arguing that there can be no injunctions granted in standard essential patents because they are needed technology, right? Whereas the same thing, you will say the contrary in the case of pharma. The whole jurisprudence is absolutely opposite. So according to me, it is not about what is good, it's not about the balance, it's about only the business, in my view. And India, according to me, is the champion of creating the balance, and India should continue the way it has continued. And I'm not saying for a moment that we should not encourage innovation. Innovation needs to be encouraged, innovation needs to be protected, but it all has to happen within its own limits. There's what is called the use of IP and there's what is called the abuse of IP. The use of IP is permissible, abuse of IP is not permissible. Thank you.
We need to have a balance, like we have this Novartis situation, right? So how exactly can we reach that balance? In this particular situation, what would have been the right approach for us to go forward?
See, according to me, in the Novartis judgment, there was very little choice for the judges because the basic molecule, imatinib, was not a patented molecule in India. It was a pre-95 drug. So according to me, 3D has struck the balance. And the fact that 3D has been replicated in so many new countries, including Philippines, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa is looking at it. In fact, Australia is looking at it. So I think 3D has struck the balance already.
See, the other thing is there is a constant attempt of extending patent life from this way or that way or other way. So 3D is striking a balance where you are saying that a scientific innovation which you do, which looks obvious to a chemist, that I deal with one molecule, I'm likely to go to the next crystal only. So it has got limited monopoly right to be worthy of. You cannot give monopoly right for something which is quite obvious. That's a very essential principle of any patent.